What I'm going to do is I'm going to tap into one of our staff members, Dr. Dan Lack, who's actually going to share a case study from one of his most recent expeditions. Dan, I would introduce you, but I just think you'll probably do a better job at introducing yourself. He's got over 600 rescues in remote and extreme environments, so he doesn't always wear those scrubs, I promise you that. Actually, last time we spoke, you were practically treating people barefoot on Lord Howe Island, is that right?
That's correct. Absolutely.
I'm going to turn over to you, Dan. You can introduce yourself.
No worries. Thanks, Sonny. So thanks everyone for coming. What my role is today is to give a case study that highlights the different dimensions of healthcare in remote and extreme environments. And specifically that it's not just a free holiday, it's not just an exciting diversion from medicine, but there's a lot of pre-planning, there's a lot of risk assessment, and there's actually the medicine you hope is actually quite boring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and give a bit of my presentation here. So I was going to do I was going to do here we go. Um, I was going to do a case study on Mongolia, but that was actually a little bit boring. So I thought I'd switch it out to give you an example of a trip I did to Kilimanjaro last year as the doctor. So this was about a year ago. So just to give you a sense of what my journey has been, I had a 20 plus year career in climate change research, mostly in the US. And while I was in the US, I was part of the busiest volunteer mountain rescue team probably in the world. And I realized that I was much better suited to being in crazy places, hanging off a rope, holding someone's, fractured femur or their broken head in my hands and working in an incredibly high functioning team. And so after about 10 years of the US and the prospect of political changes, I decided to come back to Australia and go to medical school at the age of 38. And my initial thinking was that I would study emergency medicine and I would go do expeditions as much as I could. That's not quite how it's turned out, but I think it's turned out a lot better. So at the end of medical school, I did the expedition medicine course, started the graduate certificate, and 3 years later, I started as an instructor on the expedition medicine course and now as a senior lecturer. And through this journey, all I could think about was combining all of my loves into one job. And many years ago, I lived in South Africa for a while. And so I wanted to go back to Africa. I love climbing mountains. I did that in my time in Colorado, and I've done it, climbed mountains in New Zealand, in China, in South America. And I also love photography. So I wanted to combine all these together. So Africa is because I spent time over there, and I just love being in wild places. And so the idea of combining all of those skill sets together, that's my dream job. And HRE has helped me to do that. So how did I come across this job to work as a doctor on Kilimanjaro? So as I said, the dream was to have someone pay me to travel to go to Africa, climb mountains, and be immersed in the wilds of Africa and take photos. And so my experience across the years, and plus a little bit of being a little bit cheeky, I approached a company on the Gold Coast who do Kilimanjaro treks, and I made a deal with them to become their medical director. And in exchange for that, I would get regular trips to Kilimanjaro. And I'm sure that sounds fantastic to some of you, a free trip to Kilimanjaro, getting paid. But there was a lot of work beforehand that the courses in HRE actually helped me with the skills that I needed to provide a safe expedition for people. So with any of these expeditions, we need preparation. So the first step in preparation is as a medical professional providing care. So you need the skill for the preparation in part came from HRE, but you need to prepare for the travel to Africa, multi-day trekking, and altitude as an example for Kilimanjaro. So you know, what knowledge I didn't have about travel, to Africa. I started reading. I started talking to experts. Um, and so examples of this, as you can might imagine, vaccinations, getting an assessment of the past medical history of the people that you're going with. Have they ever been to altitude? Are they on medications that are going to cause concerns at any point along the journey? Are those medications available in the country you're going to? What are the risks of carrying those medications through different borders, if any? Um, and then for Africa, quite often consider malaria. There's malaria resistance in different parts of the world, so you need to understand those. Need to see if there's side effects for the medications you're prescribing. Doxycycline cause photosensitivity if you're going to be at 6,000 meters at the roof of Africa, with high UV, that's going to be a problem. And then preparing for common presentations. So the preparation is a risk assessment, an assessment of the lay of the land that you're going into, and this happens with over many many hours and before you set foot on an airplane. Specific travel to Africa, we've already talked about the malaria and vaccinations, but you might have cultural considerations. You might be making you might be offending someone if you greet them in the wrong way or if you do something. So you need to educate yourself about those. There might be personal safety issues or geopolitical issues that you need to consider. Is there civil unrest? Is it a high risk of being mugged, that kind of thing. So yeah, there's that consideration. More prep work, talking to people about their physical fitness, their training, their equipment that's needed, and then also discussing more common presentations that might come up. So you can see what the prep work as a medical professional is going to be, but you're also a guide. Any expedition, you are not just a clinician. You might end up being the person to carry those 30-kilo boxes, to base camp. You might end up, being an assistant to the cook. Who knows what that job is going to be? On this job, I was also a guide, so I needed to familiarize myself with the trekking route, the altitude gain and loss every day, potential evacuation routes. How can we get helicopter access? I needed to tie in with the local guiding company. And then comes the real challenge of the personalities on the ground. And again, that might be other guides, it might be the clients you're serving. And those personalities are going to shift as the stress of the environment changes. And example on Kili, I'll show you that. I'll show you an example of that. You need to understand what the weather is going to be doing at that time of year, and to educate yourself on that. And then a discussion and preparation for altitude. So understanding what safe altitude ascents are, the preventative medications, the treatment medications, the monitoring that you're going to do. So bear in mind, this is all prep work, okay? So here's a map of the different treks up Kili. There is lots of different options and there's lots of different rates of ascent through all of these different camps. And so with the owner of the company, we selected the one that was going to give us the best opportunity. So my role as a medic on this trip was to monitor clients for altitude illness twice a day, monitor their psychological state, and also encourage people to come to me early. So I wasn't dealing with big issues, but I was only dealing with small issues. And then if any medical issues came up. And fortunately or unfortunately for me, it turned out to be a pretty hectic expedition in terms of medicine. So what happened? There was a lot of rain unseasonally, which can be quite beautiful at times, but it can get a lot of people down if their expensive trip to Kilimanjaro is soaked out. But what that meant that there was an incredible amount of snow up high, and I think I've got a photo here to show you. And we had a mostly really good bunch of people, really good fun. There was some tricky emotional baggage that came with some. that you or that I had to integrate immediately. So to give them the best chance of success and to hopefully prevent major issues. So, we're hiking through the rain for multiple days. We can get wet, we can get cold, we can slip over more easily. And then people's mindset can just get a little bit funky as well. But I found it quite beautiful. Here's a photo of me up on the crater just after sunrise with Kili covered in snow. It was absolutely gorgeous. So medically, what happened? Had two clients with high altitude cerebral edema, swelling of the brain due to physiology changes of high altitude. One client with a knee injury, and then there was another guide who from another company had a spontaneous pneumothorax, so a collapsed lung. And then there was one guide from our trip who had a fractured, probably a fractured ankle. So the high altitude cerebral edema will just go straight to the top. It's a complex physiology, but the brain swells and it can be fatal. The treatment is to get people down, but the most important thing is to prevent it. And so the Wilderness Medicine Society is a group in the US that provides a lot of guidelines for wilderness medicine. There's other organizations that contribute as well. There's internationally recognized guidelines for how far you should go up in a day, rest, how many rest days you should have. There's medications that can help you acclimatize. They do have side effects, quite some of them quite funky. There's an altitude illness scale that you can get a sense of how someone's doing. And one of the biggest things for prevention is actually setting people's expectations. So making them understand as the medic what you're going to be seeing, when you're going to be turning them around, so they have a sense that it's not a complete shock to them that you've tapped them on the shoulder and told them to go back down. Treatment is very simple. Get down. You can use oxygen, you can use steroids, but getting down as low as you can is the right treatment. So what happened here was there was a lady whose husband had tragically passed away. His dream was to climb Kilimanjaro. So she and her three daughters decided that they were going to do this trip in his honor, and they were going to scatter his ashes at the summit. And unfortunately, she was suffering. As soon as we started gaining decent altitude, she was suffering from major headaches, particularly fatigue, nausea. And so from the very beginning, we were chatting with her to make sure that she understood that, if she hit this level of symptoms, she would be coming down. So unfortunately, on the summit night, the observations that we made from her was that she was not going to make it, and we had to turn her around. She took the two or three guides to turn her around. We gave her oxygen, we gave her dexamethasone, and the porters just basically dragged her down the hill. There was a second client who did summit, but she was pushed beyond where she should have been against my advice, and she was quite sick as well. Both of these people had ongoing cognitive issues, temporary cognitive issues that lasted for 3 or 4 days. And within 3 weeks of our trip, there was an mid-40s Englishman who died of high altitude cerebral edema. So Kili is a very common, trek and goal for lots of people, but it can be deadly. So the knee injury was quite a funny one. This is the photos of my mate Chris. He was using this trip as a kickstart for his health reboot. He was, quite overweight. He hadn't done any training. He had bought lots of brand new gear. And he basically just didn't know what he was doing, except that he was going up. And surprisingly and frustratingly for many, he just absolutely nailed it. Like, he was tired every day, he was sweating, but he got all the way to the top, to the summit. And on the way back down, he fell over, busted his knee, and had to get carried down. So you might think that's a little bit irresponsible, but my job there on this trip was to help him in his goal. That's one of the reasons I'm there as the doctor for this trip. That the photo on the right there is a photo of him 1 year later, climbing in Central America, climbing up a volcano, and you can see he's lost a decent amount of weight. So that's a good thing. I'm facilitating his journey, and it is a great achievement. Um, so the spontaneous pneumothorax was an interesting one. The guiding on Kilimanjaro is quite well sought after for the locals. So there was a young woman who was on her first trip as a porter, and on one of the days we were coming up to a pass, and I stopped and took a few deep breaths, and I saw a pair of legs sticking out from behind a rock. I walked up and said hi, and this young lady was visibly short of breath. Her massive pack was on the ground, and she was asking for help, saying she had chest pain. So her oxygen saturations were below 80%, which is probably a bit too low for someone who should be acclimatized. Her heart rate was elevated, and I had a stethoscope. I listened to her lungs. One side of her lungs didn't have any sounds, so it was pretty obvious she had a collapsed lung on that side. The unfortunate thing for her was there was a 2 kilometer continuing up to the next camp, and it was 7 or 8 kilometers back to where the next option was to get her out. So we had to start helping her up another few hundred meters of altitude to get to camp so that she could then get down much quicker. And so there's a perfect example of risk benefit. Do you continue taking someone up in that situation so you can get them out quicker? For us, the answer was yes. She was stable, and we had lots of help from porters after a little while. So myself and the owner of the Australian company, we took it in turns in helping carrying her gear and then helping her walk into camp. Got into camp, gave her oxygen, and she was carried down later that night by the team. So here's a photo of Nate carrying the some of her gear. The credibility that Nate and I gained from the locals for taking our own packs and then the porters load was quite amazing. And that created this really lovely experience in the camp for the next couple of nights. There's a great example of the job that you might do may not be as a medic. You might just have to chip in and do whatever it takes. So they're the examples of Kilimanjaro. After that trip, everyone in our crew, we went to the Serengeti. This is a photo I took about an hour after landing in the Serengeti. One of my dreams to be sitting in the African bush, and looking at incredible wildlife, and fortunately being able to take some pretty cool photos. So hopefully that gives you a sense of my motivations and what I've been able to find through this process and incorporating HREE into my studies and experiences. And hopefully it gets you a sense for what is possible in this sphere. So that's about all I got. Happy to answer questions if we got them. And yeah, if you have questions after the fact, just get in touch, track me down.
Thanks, Dan. I have just had the second pen explode over my hands in 2 hours. Hey, listen, everyone. I mean, that's an amazing insight from Dan. What amuses me is that I mean, how many things can go catastrophically wrong in one trip? Now, these are the stories people love to hear about too. And Dan actually preempted this discussion by saying, I was going to share with you about my recent Mongolian expedition, but not that happened. You've got to understand that sometimes things go wrong on expedition and sometimes things go right. From a medical perspective, though, people are weird. It's like when things are going wrong, the medic think that's a good day. That's a good trip. But Dan, thank you for sharing that. I also just wanted to touch on some of the language that you'd probably hear both of us use sometimes than anyone working in this industry. One of the most amusing things I heard you say, Dan, was the porters dragged her down the mountain. Now, this might challenge some people because this is language we wouldn't use in a normal clinical environment. But consider too, you wouldn't piggyback someone through the ED. So what you need to understand is when we start taking ourselves way outside of the structural approaches that we have to healthcare and living, everything becomes far more basic. And I almost guarantee those poor porters that were assisting this woman down the hill would have almost physically dragged her to save her life. And that is just the nature of where we are operating in. So, Dan, always a pleasure. Great discussion. I know you're clinically working. Are there any questions for Dan specifically? I know there are some other questions, but any for Dan in case he needs to run away because he is on shift at the moment? Steph, you got any for us from anyone? Nope, I'm going to take that silence as nothing too specific. Dan, fantastic feedback. Thank you so much. One of the points I also just want to emphasize from Dan was that anyone who's going to consider working in this environment needs to consider themselves so much more than just a medic. Regardless of how you perceive yourself in leadership roles, when you join a team working in an extreme environment, whether that be a humanitarian deployment, an expedition somewhere, a filming project, historically, people are going to look at you like you're a leader. And this is a vital aspect of an area that we need to develop because if something happens to the team leaders, quite often it will default to the team medic as a 2IC or a 3IC. And quite often the medics are actually used as guides anyway. So it is just something for you to consider. Medical roles are also leadership roles. Alexis Cunnington. Oh, sorry, I got a sister from another Mister in the group. Um, we did have some questions, Steph. I've lost it. Oh, where was it? Where was it? Okay, there is one question here that basically says, what would make a team of expeditioners want to include a nurse in their team instead of a doctor? And I think this is a really important question. Um, right now on the International Space Station, they got a bunch of astronauts, they got a couple cosmonauts, and there is no doctor. In fact, the closest thing they've got to a medic up in space at the moment is actually a qualified vet. So what makes expeditionary teams want to include nurses and paramedics? There's still a clinical skill set where there would be none. At the same time, too, and I mean, Dan can speak to this from his own doctoring experience. I speak to this from a former paramedic experience. But sometimes the clinical skill set is not the limiting factor in the environment that you're working in. The limiting factor is actually the resources um, that you can access. And so what I mean by that is if you're on a high altitude climbing trip like Dan was, he's actually going to be limited not by his clinical skill set, but by what's in his backpack to assist the clinical interventions. And so sometimes what you're limited by actually doesn't differentiate that much between whether you've got a doctor, paramedic, or nurse on that team, because sometimes the interventions you can only perform are those that have enabled you to do so with what you're carrying. So um, years and years ago on a space medicine research trip we did, the medical kits that we were told to pack were not allowed to be any more than 8 kilograms. They were not allowed to be any bigger than 30 by 20 by 40 centimeters. We basically had to pack the medical kit to support a crew of 8 for up to 9 months. So you got to get creative. Every single thing that's going to be in your kit is going to have two, three, maybe four applications. And this is sometimes where improvisation and adaptation is going to be key to your survival. And these are the things that we cover in healthcare in remote extreme environments at UTAS. We're taking clinicians and we're also taking non-clinicians sometimes, and we're taking them into an environment where we can start challenging the experiences you've had to develop a new way of looking at healthcare. One last thing, just a little bit of parting advice before we get to any other questions that you may have, is that probably one of the most important aspects, and including in Dan's presentation then, is a question I get asked a lot. How do I get involved in healthcare and extreme environments? How do I get an expedition team? How do I get on a humanitarian deployment? And apart from having the skills, knowledge, and CV to do so, it is actually your network. Networking is key. You're only ever as strong, I nearly said long, as strong as your network. And you know what? Studying this program is a great way to boost that network. You're going to be taught by absolutely industry experts. You're going to be taught by industry professionals. And these are people that I said are not just active in the clinical space, they're also active in all kinds of expeditions. Dan has just come back from Mongolia. I've literally just come back from a rather unique one that's under NDAs, but we spent almost 8 days underwater. So there's a lot of opportunity, but your network is where your power will lie. And I would encourage anyone who's even had an inkling of starting a program like this to do so and throw yourself head on into it. The 8-day program with the Expedition Medicine Unit is a fantastic way of challenging everything that you thought was normal in the clinical care. And it is also a fantastic way of building your network.